Construction on the Hanford site, located near Richland, Washington, began in 1943. That year, a 120 square mile piece of land along the west side of the main Hanford worksite was designated as a restricted access security zone. In 1963, this security zone was made available to scientists for long-term research into the shrub steppe ecosystem. In 1993, Ale was renamed the Pfitzner-Eberhard Arid Lands Ecology Reserve, in honor of the two Pacific Northwest National Laboratory scientists who were killed while conducting an aerial wildlife survey near the reserve. Ale was included in the newly established Hanford Reach National Monument in June of 2000. In the 1940s, the shrub steppe landscape was dominated by big sagebrush, bitterbrush, and several native bunch grasses. However, over the decades, periodic wildfires have eliminated most of the sagebrush and other shrubs, leaving behind grasslands composed of native bunch grasses, cheatgrass, and a few small shrubs. Despite these changes, Ale continues to support a variety of native plants and wildlife that includes mule deer and a sizable herd of Rocky Mountain elk. This video will take a brief look at life on Ale shortly before and after the wildfire of August 2007 that charred more than 60,000 of the 77,000 total acres on the reserve. From the beginning, Ale was home to a variety of plant, animal, bird, and insect species. Now, the most visible animals on the reserve are Rocky Mountain elk, mule deer, and coyotes. Of these, elk are by far the most numerous. An aerial survey during January 2007 estimated the elk herd at nearly 650 animals. The elk tended to congregate into groups containing 200 to 300 animals. During the daylight hours, one group can be seen in the flatlands along Highway 240, just north of Richland. By late afternoon, all of the groups began to move quickly toward private wheat fields that lie just beyond the western border of Ale. Once the elk reached the wheat, they would spend most of the night grazing. As dawn approached, they would return quickly to the safety of the reserve. There are far fewer mule deer on Ale than there are elk. The deer forage mainly in small, scattered groups. As with the elk, the deer spend at least part of their day grazing in the nearby wheat fields. Here, the fawns could find time to play while the adults grazed. Less commonly seen are smaller mammals such as porcupine, badger, black-tailed jackrabbits, and nocturnal animals such as the bushy-tailed wood rat and deer mouse. An infrared camera recorded small bats foraging over the water at Snively Springs. On a nearby ridge, a coyote searched for lunch and found a small, tasty rodent. Very few tall trees remain on the reserve. Those few attract red-tailed hawks and great-horned owls. These two species are not always friendly to each other. On the ground nearby, two long-billed curlews searched for insects among the flowers. As a mourning dove watched from a dead branch. Along Rattlesnake Creek, a Lincoln sparrow called for a mate. And a short-eared owl watched for rodents and lizards. Riparian zones around a few permanent water sources such as Snively Springs attract a diversity of migratory birds. Early one morning, a northern saw-whet owl chased after a deer mouse. Other bird species videoed include a western kingbird, an eastern kingbird, Bullock's oriole, a red-breasted nuthatch, and a robin. Later in the spring, a pair of house finches made a nest in the loose bark of a dead tree. On the ground, a white-crowned sparrow hopped over a mud puddle near two tiger swallowtail butterflies. In Snively Canyon, a male California quail strolled down the road in search of seeds. Suddenly, two male chukars ran down the road, and neither seemed to be in a friendly mood. For several minutes, they ignored everything around them as they battled for primary breeding territory in the canyon. After the battle, the winner advertised his availability. Throughout the spring and summer, many species of wildflowers bloomed and then disappeared across the reserve. These include pussy willows and yellow bells in the early spring, shooting stars, lupin, balsam root, and phlox later and into summer. At Snively Springs, flowering cottonwood trees spread a layer of white across the area. In the early evening, elk would gather near the spring to graze and drink. One young bull became intrigued with the camera lens and decided to investigate. So much for the idea that elk are repelled by human scent. By midsummer, the reserve was covered with wildflowers and grasses. At this time, most of the grasses, especially the omnipresent cheatgrass, had flowered and become very dry. By early August, these tender dry conditions held the potential for big trouble, not only for plants of the area, but also wildlife, especially the very young. On the morning of August 16, 2007, a small grass fire began near Watoma Road on private land at the northwest corner of Ale. That small fire, fanned by strong westerly winds, quickly spread across the tender dry Ecology Reserve. By the time it was contained 2 days later, the fire had blackened more than 60,000 of the 77,000 acres on the reserve. Hills and flatlands that were covered with lush grasses only a few days earlier were suddenly charred and bare. Piles of ash marked the location where bunch grasses and sagebrush once stood. Among the ashes were carcasses of small insects that were either too small or too slow to escape the flames. Large animals, including deer and elk, were nowhere to be seen on the barren landscape. Distinct trails across the blackened hillsides stood as stark testimony that the elk herds once passed this way. Despite the devastation, life on the reserve soon began to return. A week after the fire, a badger ambled down the road near Rattlesnake Springs, where some sagebrush and rabbitbrush plants had escaped the fire. A few hardy plant species such as saltgrass and nettles began to grow in the charred areas. Insects appeared wherever live plants were found. Several species of birds scavenged for seeds and insects among the ash. Although most of the plants on the hillsides and ridges had burned, the riparian areas around both Snively and Rattlesnake Springs were only moderately damaged. At both springs, water continued to flow, and many inhabitants continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. In Snively Canyon, scattered groups of gray partridge and chukar searched for food among the rocks and the scorched shrubs. Two large bucks watched the birds in apparent amusement. Even a porcupine in a tree that had escaped the fire seemed undisturbed. Nightlife along Snively Creek also continued much as before. For several days after the fire, only an occasional elk was seen walking across the burned landscape. The majority of the herds remained in the hills close to the west border fence. Trails across the fence and through the fire break indicated the elk regularly visited the wheat stubble on private lands. In the early morning hours, one favorite elk feeding area just beyond the border fence contained 200 to 300 animals in scattered groups. Before the fire, most of these animals would retreat to the safety of ale around daybreak. The fire eliminated virtually all of the easy forage on the reserve. Consequently, for weeks after the fire, many of the elk appeared reluctant to leave the private wheat fields, even during daylight hours. Here, as the rutting season began, bulls began to vie for cows. By mid-morning, some of the animals, especially the large bulls without harems, began to make their way slowly back to the border fence. Once they crossed the fence, they would continue slowly down the canyon towards one of the springs. If a vehicle appeared on the horizon, elk in the wheat fields would quickly dash for the safety of the reserve. Once on the move, they would continue running across the dusty landscape, creating large dust clouds as they disappeared in the distance. When the main hunting season began, elk resumed their pattern of feeding at night and moving back onto Ale just prior to daylight. Ultimately, the winter rains and snows began. Quickly, the cheatgrass and Sandberg's bluegrass began to grow across the reserve. Although many effects of the fire remain, a new crop of grasses and forbs are on their way to provide food and shelter to a wide variety of animals, birds, and insects. How life after the fire will compare with life before remains to be seen.